So welcome everyone to another one of our Top Step webinars. Today's topic is going to focus on timesheets and timesheet accuracy. So really kind of going over some of the configuration options that we work with customers to make it as painless as possible to get timesheets in when people are putting them in through the UI or through the mobile app, and some tips you may be able to take away from this that would be helpful to your organization. Basically, what are some configuration options we see that are helpful for customers? As any situation is, it all depends on your process. And then also talk about some things like what you can do to auto-populate timesheets to make data entry simple for your team, what to avoid in that situation, and then of course how to fix timesheets and ways that you can do timesheet corrections. So let's go ahead and just jump into it. With the first part, which is, sort of timesheet setup configuration options that you could consider. So whenever we're working with customers to, set up their timesheets, there's a few basic questions that get asked to see, because timesheets actually are a big part of using OpenAir to capture information about the work that's been delivered on projects, of course. So there always is a tendency to try and capture as much data as possible on timesheets, but the more you put on a timesheet, the more effort it is for your team to enter data, and there could be errors. It could take a long time, so there's administration time. So our big thing is trying to make sure that the timesheet is set up in a way to capture the proper data, but with minimizing the amount of information that the end user has to type in. So things like fields per timesheet row, a lot of times it's project and task. Some customers only do projects, but then there's other things that you want to track, like is it billable or non-billable? Is it a certain type of role that you're playing? And all those items just add more fields. So the more you can put into the setup of the project, the less you have to have the end user put on the timesheet. So minimizing the number of fields per row is really a goal of ours, because that means it's less effort for the end user to put data on the timesheet. Okay. Some of you also may have the hours remaining feature, which is another option that you can display on a timesheet, and it really is meant to help with project management, budget management. So if you're given 10 hours to do something, it can say, okay, you only have 2 hours left based on your budget. But a lot of times I see people wanting this feature to work a certain way, but it only works one way. And the way that it works is it is completely dependent on the number of hours that people are assigned to work, not booked if you're using bookings, but it's assignments. And there's also a way for end users to override that data, which then changes the hours remaining inside the project. So there's some give and take in using this feature to be aware of. Now, next to every time entry, there's a description and a notes field. I do find often that those fields tend to be redundant when you're trying to put, you just really want to capture notes. You don't necessarily need a description. What you may not know is you can actually hide or turn off that description field. And that actually is a control that's in the other settings area of your timesheet settings. If you look for the word description, if I can type, you can actually hide that primary description field and just have the notes field, which is a pretty common thing that I see a lot of customers wanting to do. And then finally, if you do have multiple fields on your project, your timesheet, besides obviously selecting the project, things like time type or payroll type or job code, all of those fields actually have a default option that you can turn on, so that when you create a new timesheet, it allows the end user to default a value that may be quite common. Here at Top Step, we have a couple of fields where we're tracking the location of where work is being done and whether it's remote or on site. So we have those default fields set up so that when we create our timesheet, every new row on the timesheet inherits the default, and we only have to override it on exception. So that saves us some time. Now, besides the configuration of the timesheet, there's also what are the rules that you have to apply when somebody submits a timesheet, and what's a valid timesheet. So one of the things on the timesheet rule that's very helpful is being able to have like a minimum and a maximum number of hours per week or hours per day. And there's actually a setting called percent of work schedule, as well as fixed hours. I like to recommend using the percent of work schedule, because what that does is it gives you the ability to set people with different hours per week and have the rules apply to their particular situation. If everyone in your company is 40 hours a week, then it doesn't really matter which option you pick. But if you do have, some people that are 44 hours a week, some people are 24 hours a week, this percentage of work schedule works really nicely. And timesheet period. So commonly I see timesheets being done on a weekly basis, but that's not the only option that you have. You have daily, you have semi-monthly, bi-weekly, and monthly options to consider for your timesheets. And it doesn't have to be all or nothing on a setting. When you decide the timesheet period, if it's weekly, let's say you have a team that does monthly timesheets and a team that does weekly timesheets. OpenAir can actually accommodate both in the same instance. What you have to do is you have to actually default your company setting to something, and that's quite often it's weekly. In fact, I think new systems that are procured by or provisioned by NetSuite are automatically set to weekly. But there is another switch that you can turn on, which allows you at the user level to override that company setting, so that you can actually set individuals to have monthly timesheets, even though your default is weekly. And you can mix and match that way if you really want to. And that really helps for companies that have very diverse teams, so they have diverse timesheet requirements, and this timesheet period is a good one, a good example of that. Now, the other thing to think about when timesheet setup comes to play is how to handle month end. So the very first thing you have to do when you're dealing with timesheets is you have to talk to finance and find out, what is their month end schedule or their calendar, their accounting calendar. Because some companies have a strict requirement that we need to take all the time and all the revenue up until the last day of the month. And when you have that type of requirement, when the end of the month happens in the middle of a week and your timesheets are weekly, then you have to consider, like, how do you make sure people are putting in 2 timesheets for that week? That's not everyone's requirement. If you're on a 445 calendar, accounting calendar, you tend not to have to deal with this. But if you do have that month-end split, there are configurations that'll help your end users remember that there's a month-end. The 2 options, and these are my terms, one is called proper month-end split, which is, if the 30th or the 31st ends on a Tuesday and you create a timesheet for that week, the timesheet only has the days 29, 30, 31. That's it. And then if you want to enter for the second half of the week, you have to create a second timesheet, and it'll automatically know that you're wanting it to go the first, second, third, and so forth. I call that the proper month-end split timesheet. And when you have that switch enabled, there's actually a secondary switch that will automatically create the second timesheet for you, the second half of the week, when you submit that first one. So I always recommend people to use that switch to make it easy for your end users to remember. There's another variation of that proper month-end split, and that is a switch that says prevent time entry on the same day across timesheets. And this one is preferred for those of you who have a variable month end, which means you may be the 29th, it may be the 2nd, it all depends on where the day of the week lands. And so instead of having it be strictly on the end of the month, you can actually have it be a variable month end in that case. And then once you have the timesheet itself set up, now you have to also deal with the fact that what projects are people allowed to see on the timesheet. So there are configuration controls for project access, but there's also things like filter sets that are controls that you can use for data access. From a configuration perspective, in the timesheet settings area, you can actually tell the system people can only enter time on projects that they're assigned to or that they're booked to. And if you're not familiar with where that is, if you go to timesheet settings, other settings, right here is do not allow time. Sorry, that's not, hang on, I have to find it again. Oh, maybe we don't have it turned on. If booked to a closed task, of course, you want to be able to stop time entry if it's a closed task. But basically, if you are not scheduled to a project or if you're not assigned to a project, these are checkboxes in the settings area that can prevent you from being able to see that project on your timesheet. So those options here with the assignment and the bookings, I think we have an assignment in here in ours. I should have looked it up before I got on the webinar. But those are two options that you have to be able to just give people basic access to projects and tasks on the timesheet. Are those checkboxes in the timesheets area? Okay. My recommendation of which of those to check is really what are you using for resource management? Because if people are getting scheduled to projects, then using those configuration options to say if I'm booking people to a project, so therefore I'm going to use bookings as my control to give people access to the project. If you're assigning people to tasks because you want budgets, then the assignment could be your control because you're also wanting to use a budget control as well as scheduling. So many of you, if you're looking at your open air system, you probably have a filter set called booked assigned. And that is a kind of a combination of these two, but first and foremost, there's a configuration control on timesheets that give you the ability to say whether you can even see the project at all. Now, you may be able to see the project, but then the other part of the equation is tasks. Not everyone records time to the task level, but it's quite a common configuration. From a task perspective, the most common approaches that I see as far as once you have access to the project, what task can you see, is controlling task access based on the tasks that you are assigned to. So you could have 10, 15 tasks and you're only assigned to 2, you only see those 2 that you're assigned to. That's quite common. That gives you more control as a project manager. But an equally common approach that I see is when somebody has access to a project, they can see all the tasks. So it doesn't matter if they're assigned or not, they can record time. When you have that configuration in place, although it's easy for the user to pick the right task, first remember that they're going to see all the tasks, so they have a decision to make. And second, if you've used any kind of budgets or assignments to control budgets, they may be picking a task that they weren't budgeted to work on. So I always like to recommend first the assigned at the task level approach because that has more control, but that really depends on your process. Okay, so those are ways to get access to the project. Now the final way is using a filter set, and the filter set is a way that you can actually control not only what projects you see, but things related to the way that you've been set up to see the project. So if you use bookings, for example, as your control to be able to see projects, you can actually say, but you can only see projects with a booking type of confirmed or scheduled, something like that. So the filter sets themselves, you can add additional controls for project stages, add additional controls for booking types. So in addition to just the configuration options of timesheets, you can actually enforce things like once the project's moved to close, whether it's active or inactive, people can't see it because the filter set prevents that. If you're not aware of filter sets, there's a whole nother webinar we could do on that. But filter sets, actually, you can have a filter set per module. So there's a module override in OpenAir on the user record. So you can have users be able to see projects in the projects module much differently than when they turn into the timesheet module. So that's how you can, you have a primary filter set which controls your view in in the system in general, but then you can override the modules with a different filter set. And that's quite common for the timesheet module because you want to limit people to only see themselves, or maybe they only see projects that are, you know, in the active stage or in process stage or whatever. So timesheet overrides and expense module overrides are quite common, I find, in configuration needs for customers. And of course, limiting the projects that you see on the timesheet reduces the amount of time it should take for the consultant to put their timesheet in, you know, the time in for the timesheet. And that's the important part, is we want to make it as easy as possible for the end user and make it as straightforward and streamlined for them. Okay. Now, of course, people will be late on timesheets. It happens to the best of us. So there is a late timesheet alert, a standard alert that you can configure in the system. You can configure it to run a specific day of the week or a day of the month, like the 4th or the 5th. You know, it depends on, again, what your timesheet period is. If you have a weekly timesheet, you probably are going to try and schedule it to run like every Tuesday or every Wednesday, whenever the submission date is. Okay. What a lot of people don't realize on the alert, the late timesheet alert, is the late timesheet alert will send to anyone that qualifies for that alert, and it'll look at, first and foremost, of course, you know, timesheet. Is the timesheet even there, you know, in the system, or has it been submitted yet in the system? But there's other parts of the alert that you can configure which more accurately direct the alert to the people who really should be getting it. So if I go into the timesheets module, the alerts are also here, as well as in the timesheet settings. And one thing to be aware of course, it's going to look at, like, it's going to look for a timesheet with a specific number of days ago. But consider having it only send to people who have like a timesheet required checkbox. Not everyone in your organization is required to put a weekly timesheet in or a semi-weekly timesheet in, especially people in like finance that are just using the system to do invoicing. They shouldn't get the alert, okay, if they're not using timesheets. So if you use this timesheet required option, that targets it to those people who actually should be putting a weekly timesheet in. The other thing I'd like to highlight is that there are actually controls here that you would use specifically with people who are sort of infrequent users or contractors, that you would want to send them a reminder only if they've been scheduled to do work that week. So if there's no scheduled work for them, they shouldn't get a reminder to put their timesheet in because, well, they weren't scheduled to do any work. So that's where these items like current booking, current task assignment come into play. It ties into your resource management, so you're only sending the reminder to people who are supposed to, you know, make sure they get their timesheets in. So think about those options down here, and don't just, you know, send it to everyone in the organization, because it's one of the emails that people start ignoring very quickly. So we want to target it specifically for the right people. The last recommendation I have is regarding the time zone. So unless you have a global policy that everyone is aligned to a certain time zone, consider setting up these alerts by time zone so that somebody is not getting the email at 2 o'clock in the morning when they haven't even gotten to the office yet, and it gets buried in all the other emails that they have. So if it's 9 o'clock in each of the different areas of the world that people are in, set up a time zone based report. All of the timesheet alerts are triggered on an East Coast time zone, but of course you can set that at various times of day. Okay. There's also a standard overdue approvals email that you can set up, that alert you can set up, that I recommend to set that up to run every day. So as soon as a timesheet's been submitted, if it hasn't been touched in a day or so, that reminder comes out. That way the overdue approvals is sort of a gentle nudge that you need to get those timesheets cleared up. Another thing just to be aware of it is with approval processes, you can actually have sort of escalation routing, I like to say. So you can actually route the timesheet for approval after so many days if there hasn't been any activity on the approval. So it would go to like a backup person, like your maybe office admin or project admins or something like that. If you're not familiar with that process, if you go into the approval process area, if you take an approval process, and if you set 2 of the approvers to the same sequence and check the box that says a sequence only requires 1 approval, you'll see that this changed quickly, and now we have an assign after so many days. So if this manager hasn't taken action after 2 days, then it would get routed to Jeanette, and then Jeanette would be the person who would also be able to approve it. And that's a nice little sort of backup feature for those of you who have, you know, the administrators in the system to handle that. Now, from a reporting perspective, many of you are already aware in the advanced reports of OpenAir, there's a missing timesheet report, which really just focuses on missing timesheets, but there's a timesheet status report as well, which is what almost every company uses. If they're putting timesheets in, they're using the timesheet status report. A recommendation I have for customers to be able to kind of focus on things regarding the timesheet status is to be able to configure the report so that you ignore approved timesheets. So you're only getting missing, rejected, and possibly submitted. I call that the action list or the bad list report. So if all the timesheets are supposed to be approved by Tuesday morning, if you run this timesheet status report without approved timesheets in it, then you'll get the exception list of people to follow up on, and some of them are your approvers that you have to check in with. Okay. The other report that I like to recommend be set up is something for the project dashboard, and actually it's a way to see who's holding up your timesheet if you don't have access to the timesheet status report, because the timesheet status report focuses on the timesheet. Many times I get the question of, well, who's holding up, you know, the timesheet for this, the time for this project, and the timesheet status report doesn't look at projects, it only looks at the timesheet. So if you actually set up a report that you can put onto your project dashboard, I quickly created this one called Submitted Time Current Approver. When I run that report, it's a timesheet, a time entry detail report. The time entry detail report will give you like who the current approver is, and of course, if the timesheet is being held up, but it's not being held up for this project, you'll see that it gives you a little note that says, by the way, this piece of the timesheet is approved, but the rest of the timesheet's still in submitted stage. So that's a nice little feature to kind of see like who's holding it up that you need to take action to follow up with on for a project as a project manager. Okay. Now, there are additional standard fields, time type, service field, payroll type, job code even are fields that can also show up on the timesheet. Time type and service are nice options to consider for a timesheet because they're also able to be controlled by filter sets, and they each have this limit by project option, which means you can limit the time types that are applicable to a project or services that are applicable to a project. The payroll type, although it's used quite often, there's no filtering on that one. So it's sort of like whatever the list is, everyone has access to it always, and you can't hide it for certain people. So that one is really more for a standard list that everyone would have to put that on their timesheet if you wanted to use these. Of course, these are all options and additional fields to put on your timesheet entry. Okay. Now, from an auto population perspective, when you're thinking about your timesheet, people can create a new timesheet and fill it in blank, of course, but there is a clone option. Everyone has this clone option. You can turn it off, but the timesheet clone option is when you click, go to create a new timesheet, say new clone, and it'll copy whatever timesheet you tell it to. You can configure it so it's only copying the list of projects and not the hours that were associated to those projects. That's something that you can configure as part of the clone feature itself with form permissions. But another thing that I don't know if people are aware of it quite often is there's an auto creation feature, and it's actually part of the timesheet rules, believe it or not. It's not an internal switch or anything. So you can have it so that when somebody submits their timesheet, it automatically creates their next timesheet for them, which is a really nice feature to kind of get people in the frame of mind of all they have to do is fill it out and submit it. They don't have to do any other actions, and the system will take care of everything else, including month end. That month end overlap one, the auto creation works for that too. And if you're not familiar with if you didn't realize where that is, it's under the timesheet settings area here, under the timesheet rules. And in addition to the rules, there's this section here that says, create a new timesheet. And what do you do when it gets created? So it's typically, you know, you copy over the project list and clear the hours. And then it's up to the individual to delete any rows that don't make any sense or add new projects, of course. The other thing I like to recommend for timesheet population is using those default fields. So like on our timesheets I mentioned, our timesheets have a default option for something called work site, which is time type, and client location, which is payroll type. So we can actually use these because they're, you know, for internal work, it's pretty standard for me to put none in VA and then we're good to go. And that would default on every row in my timesheet automatically. Now, other auto-populate options include when you use schedule requests. So some of you are using schedule requests. You may have renamed it PTO request or something. But when people put their schedule request in for vacation, then that request can auto-populate in your timesheet, which is a really nice time saver and a reminder to folks that, hey, by the way, you had put in vacation, did you take it? Okay, so they don't have to remember to type that in. It's just automatically put into the system, into the timesheet. But there is an option for you to be able to populate booked hours and booked project information in your timesheet. So that option is available in the timesheet settings. If you bring in the bookings into your timesheet, there are a couple of cautions with this. The good news is you can filter it by booking type. So you're only bringing in things like confirmed work, for example. But many of us that are using bookings, Top Step included, we schedule on a weekly boundary. So we're like, hey, we just need you to work 10 hours sometime this week. So a 10-hour 1-week booking would come in as 2 hours every day, Monday through Friday. And now the user has to actually clean the data up. They have to delete the 2 hours and put the 4 hours here and 6 hours, whatever they ended up working. So sometimes this auto-population from bookings, although it may sound attractive, actually is more work for the end user because they're having to clean up what comes in because it's not quite accurate. So just keep that in mind. If that seems appealing, take a look at your booking data to see if it actually would be useful or not. And of course, when the timesheets are actually submitted, people make mistakes or they forget something, and so you have to fix them. So the 3 approaches for fixing timesheets are, first and foremost, just unapproving it, which basically opens it back up and the end user has to fix it, okay? But of course, if it's been exported into another system or if you've already started billing, time billing, then you can't even do this step because it's already been locked. Which means the user could also create what's called an overlapping timesheet and do the adjustments correctly. They could, move hours from X to Y, but this requires somebody to be actually creating a timesheet and doing the manual adjustment and then resubmitting it for approval. All very, very painful, especially if you're trying to proxy as the person to do it for them. Okay. So really the preferred way for timesheet adjustments is to use this timesheet adjustment feature. And it is controlled by roles. Administrators have it automatically. And it's a feature that's typically turned on for a lot of customers. You may not know it, but it's available in the tips area. So if you're inside a timesheet in the edit tab and you click on the tips area, you'll see the word adjust. And what it allows you to do is you just change the timesheet the way it should look. And when you hit save, depending on a second switch that you have turned on, the save would either have an open adjusted timesheet that then requires submission for approval, review and approval, or it would automatically approve that timesheet. And to be honest, it's 50-50 depending on what your policies are and whether people auto approve it or not. The thing about the timesheet adjustment feature is definitely use it, of course, to fix timesheets at month end. But if there's a person that habitually is doing timesheets wrong, you definitely want to get in there and have them fix the timesheet. So you want to sort of do the unapproved option or the rejection option first, and not have the timesheet adjustment be a crutch. So the timesheet adjustment is very helpful, very useful. I definitely recommend people look at this feature. but definitely make sure that if somebody is making the same mistake over and over and over again, hit them with training and try to adjust that behavior. Okay. So with that, we're actually at the end already. Basically, there's a lot of configuration related to timesheets, and this was just hitting the tip of the iceberg. But keep in mind, your end users are the ones that are putting your timesheets in. So streamline the timesheet to capture the basics of what you need to do, reporting and billing and project management. Keep in mind the number of projects or how many projects tasks people can see on their timesheet, because if they're using the mobile app, the more you can see in the UI, the mobile app, of course, is a smaller screen, so it takes a long time to scroll through stuff. Okay. Definitely leverage filter sets wherever you can, and options to be able to filter, to whittle down those lists as necessary. And any type of auto create saves the end user at least a step in the creating a timesheet thing. So consider those features as well. And finally, the timesheet adjustment, it's finance's best friend, honestly, to be able to fix things quickly at the end. But don't use that as a crutch to change behavior. If somebody's making the same mistake all the time, make sure that you address that as well. So that will wrap it up